The War of 1812 is oftentimes seen as kind of the war that history classes leave behind. They don't talk about it very much. But if we really look at and examine the history of it, we can see that it's our last war with Great Britain, the last time we're going to fight against England. A lot of people at the time saw it as the Second War of Independence, trying to prove that we actually could handle ourselves if we were fighting against Great Britain, and many other things. There were many reasons for going to war, and we're going to examine those and the results of going to war in this slideshow. To set the stage, we need to talk about the problems that the United States was having with the British people um, leading up to the War of 1812. The first problem is that there was a blockade on, and a blockade is basically a row of ships or an area that's patrolled by ships that does not allow any ships coming through it that are shipping things that they don't want coming in. So Britain was blocking all of our ships from going over to France and selling our goods, and so therefore they were costing us money because they just would say turn around and go back home. They wouldn't allow us to move through. So that's what a blockade is. It's trying to stop any ships from coming through. The second thing we already talked about, we talked about impressment. Impressment was that kidnapping of these sailors that were on these merchant ships of the US. And again, people were upset because their dads, their brothers, their husbands were being forced into a navy, forced into fighting a war that they had no reason to be in. They didn't want to fight against France. They had no reason for it. Okay. And then the third is stirring up the natives. And the British were stirring up the natives. What they were doing is they were going to Canada, where Tecumseh had run off to after his entire tribe had been essentially wiped out by William Henry Harrison, and the British were helping them out, helping Tecumseh to keep his power up by selling them weapons, trying to get them as much weapons as possible. And then the last thing that happened, and this was kind of one of the straws that broke the camel's back, there was an attack in Virginia. In Virginia, there was a ship called the HMS Leopard, and that was a British ship. If I say HMS, it's definitely going to be a British ship because that means Her Majesty's ship, and USS means United States ship. Okay, and so the HMS Leopard ended up attacking a ship and coming up to the Chesapeake. And they said to the Chesapeake, which was an American ship, they said, we need to search it. We heard that there are deserters on board here. We heard that there are people that used to be in the Royal Navy and that left us. Okay, and the Chesapeake said no. The Leopard started to ready itself to open fire, and it got a few shots off. And they said, hold on, we're not ready to fight. We can't fight you. And so the Chesapeake surrendered. What happened is the British came in and captured the men that were on board and pressed them, whether they were deserters or not deserters. So everybody was impressed, and it was just a bad situation. And so with all of these problems happening, when Thomas Jefferson was in charge, and he was doing nothing about it. He was doing very, very little about it. And so in the newspapers, a Massachusetts senator by the name of Josiah Quincy said this quote that's on the bottom here. He said that Thomas Jefferson was a dish of skim milk curdling at the head of our nation. Think about that, dish of skim milk. Skim milk is the lowest fat, so it's very, very weak milk. You think of it as weak, and it's sitting there curdling, meaning it's rotting at the head of our nation. He's very weak, and he's doing nothing to help the situation. So what was Jefferson doing? What was his policy? Well, it was called peaceable coercion. This is something that he called peaceable coercion. And peaceable coercion, it means that you are trying to coerce or force someone into doing something through peace. So it's an idea of I am going to force them to do what we want them to do, is what Jefferson thought, but we are not going to fight them. And so his plan was to go through with this Embargo Act of 1807. And the Embargo Act of 1807 said, well, they don't even have to blockade us or do anything like that because we are not going to allow our ships to go over and trade in those other countries. And so Thomas Jefferson said, we're not trading with France. We're not trading with England. We're not trading with Germany. We're not trading with anybody. Okay, and this was his plan. And he thought, well, once they don't have our goods, England's going to back off all this stuff that they've been doing. They're going to be hurt by it. But who did it actually hurt the most? It kind of is obvious when we look at it now that it hurt America worse than anybody else. Okay, there's no money flowing in. There's no way for them to make money from these other countries. And so the question becomes, what happened to Jefferson's idea of laissez-faire? Now he's making a government policy that shuts down his own businesses. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't fit with his ideals. And so it was a very bad stroke of policy making by Thomas Jefferson. As I said before, after Tecumseh was defeated, the Native Americans went to Canada. Canada was part of Britain at the time. It just was Britain, just like the 13 colonies were before. And so really they ran away to England. And they found very quickly that they could be allies with the British people. And so the British people were selling them guns and doing other things like that. And so the United States was getting really mad because, as we read in the Declaration of Independence, we kind of saw the Native Americans as savages, as these terrible people who would come and kill you for no reason. And so the fact that the British were backing up the savages and making alliances with the savages made us think of them as in a very, very negative way. And so we had, led by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, which we'll meet both of them later, very influential senators, Americans started to say, we need to go to war. We need to fight these guys. Okay, the only place that it was really, the war cry was kind of weak was in New England, because they wanted to make as much money as they could, fighting or trading with New England, or with England, I'm sorry. Okay, and so the Warhawks had these reasons for wanting war, and these were kind of the here's the problems with the British, here's why we should actually fight. And the first one was we need to stop the British aid to the natives. We have to stop them arming the natives because the natives are continuing to attack, and their attacks are getting bigger and more powerful in the north. The second thing was we need to just kick the British out of Canada. Maybe even, if we're lucky, we could kick them out and take over that land and take over all of Canada and kind of build this huge empire in America where we own the whole thing. And then the last thing was the British sea hostilities. So they're coming in, they're attacking our ships like the Chesapeake, and they're kidnapping our people. And so the impressment as well as the attacks were these three big reasons that we wanted war. For all the reasons that we said before, people wanted war, and it just started to get more and more intense, and people started to jump on board with this idea of wanting war, and it turned from this whole thing of we want war to instead we actually need war. We absolutely need to go to war with Britain if they do not stop what they're doing right now. And so, if you remember, the British are fighting a war against France right now. They're fighting Napoleon right during this time. And so they were trying to get out of the war. They didn't want to fight at all. They said, we don't want war. And so they said, we will stop and not interfere, not mess around with American shipping at all. We'll get rid of our impressment. We'll get rid of our blockade. We'll get rid of all of those things. And we just don't want to fight. And so the problem was, when they made this decision, we didn't know what was happening because we didn't have telephones, we didn't have email, we had no way of communicating with them. And so they had sent a letter saying that they were going to stop all of these things, and it takes weeks and weeks to get across the ocean and to us. And so during that time, we declared war on them. 2 days before that letter got to America, we had already declared war and started fighting against Britain. Okay, and so on June 18th, James Madison, the fourth president of the U.S., there's a name, you should go towards the back and find that name, James Madison declared war. it was not a really great time to declare war because what Thomas Jefferson had done is he had weakened the military. Remember, he had weakened it because he reduced it with his cuts, with his Republican cuts. He wanted the military to be smaller. He didn't think we needed it. And so we literally had 16 ships and less than 7,000 troops. Okay, and these 16 ships and less than 7,000 troops, not even very good troops. Great ships because they were brand new. So that was the one thing we had going for us. But the troops were not very good. Okay, they had bad training and they had young officers. And if we think about this, we put these two things together. If they're young officers in 1812 and the last war was in 1776, okay, that means that these young officers have never ever fought in a war. The only people they've ever fought were the natives, which were greatly outmatched. Okay, and so it's kind of interesting to see that these people that had never been in war were trying to train other people on how to fight a war. They didn't know how. They didn't know how to fight a war, and so it was kind of, it was just ended up being really, really bad training. Okay, and so we had bad military members and a very small number of them, and a small number of ships, even though they were good. During the first phase of the War of 1812, the British could not focus on us. They couldn't focus all the way on us and send all their people to us because they were still fighting a war with France, and France was a way bigger threat. France was really, really close to them, and France was a much more powerful country than the United States at that time. Okay, and so what did they actually do in America? Well, first off, they started with a naval blockade, and this blockade was set up all around America to shut down the ports, not let any ships, whether they're military ships or just citizen ships, it didn't matter, okay, not let any of them in or out of any of the ports. And so that was the first step. And then what was happening with the United States is our Navy was amazing. We had only those 16 ships. We were building more, but they were brand new ships, the best technology possible. And so there we had one ship called Old Ironsides. That was the nickname of it. It was actually called the USS Constitution. So if you want the actual name, here it is, the Constitution, but it was nicknamed Old Ironsides. Okay, and it was called Old Ironsides because it was made of wood. It wasn't made of iron. Okay, but that wood was so thick that it actually ended up when a cannonball came in, it would hit the side of it and it would bounce off into the water and not affect it at all, as if it was made out of metal. So they called it Old Ironsides because of that. And at one point, Old Ironsides came up against the Guerriere is the name of the ship that it was. You can see it right there, how to spell it. But it was the Guerriere, and they fought this naval battle right off the coast of America, and it lasted for an hour. They were fighting each other and firing and firing and firing cannons back and forth. And every time a cannon hit Old Ironsides, it would just bounce off. The ball would just bounce off and do no harm at all. And eventually, Old Ironsides got a shot in, and it hit the mast of the Guerriere. And as you can see with this picture, there's no mast here. There's no sailing part up there. And so once that cracks and falls down, now you can't move anymore. The other ship has the ability to move wherever they want, and you don't have any ability. And so you're basically just sitting there waiting to get shot to death by the other side. And so the Guerriere surrendered. We also had another brand new ship called the USS United States that was winning similar victories to the USS Constitution. And these naval battles and the victories that were coming from them was helping to build the United States confidence. And so our confidence was gaining during this first phase of the war, at least in the sea. On land, the war was not going nearly as well. And part of the reason is because of this man, and again, a man, so you should be looking in the back of your notes to find him. His name is General William Hull. General William Hull was in charge of the first operation to go in and attack the British on land. And of course, the closest place to attack the British on land was in Canada, which was part of Britain. And so General Hull started right here in this area in Detroit, and he pushed his way up into Canada. Okay, so his plan was to go in and to take over some British forts and and kind of show them that America was not somebody that you could mess around with. And so he went in and started to push in. Then, as he was on his way to meet the British at the first battle, he started to get nervous and he started to think, uh-oh, I'm not sure we have enough soldiers, I'm not sure we're well enough trained, and I just don't know. And so what he did is he decided that he was going to turn them around and start retreating. And so he turned around and started heading back. When he turned around, of course, the British were right there to follow after him. In battle, one of the main things that you realize really quickly is the people that turn and retreat usually get what's called routed. Usually the people that are pursuing the retreaters, they'll come up from behind, and if you think about you're in a fight and somebody starts to walk away from you, their back is exposed to you. You can shoot them, hit them, whatever, harass them as they're trying to get away. And also, usually if it's a group of people trying to get away, they're not super organized because they're afraid for their lives, and so they get all disorganized and it's easy to capture them. And so the British started to follow this group and harass them all the way back. And the British went in and they actually were able to take over. They came into America and took over Detroit without even firing a single shot, and 2,000 American soldiers were captured because General William Hull was too nervous to follow through with his attack. Oliver Hazard Perry is one of the heroes of the War of 1812. It actually, what he did went pretty well. In Lake Erie, which is halfway between, it's in between America and Canada, the Americans were building a new fleet to fight against the British. They were building a whole fleet or a big group of ships. Fleet is another word for a group of ships. And so they were making all of these new ships. And the British realized, well, if they can make these ships, then they're going to be a bigger threat to us. So let's attack them while the ships are still being made. And so not even all of the ships were finished yet, and the British came in and attacked the fleet. When they attacked the fleet, the Oliver Hazard Perry was in charge of the flagship of the fleet. So the main ship in the fleet, it was called the Lawrence, the USS Lawrence. And it was really a point of honor for him. He always had this banner, as you can see right here, with this misspelling that it had on it, that said, "Don't give up the ship." And so basically it was, we will fight till the end, we'll go down with the ship, no matter what, we will continue to fight. And so kind of a funny story, because after 2 hours of cannon battle, just constant back and forth and trying to get position and shooting cannonballs after each other, the USS Lawrence started to sink. It was destroyed. Okay, and so what Oliver Hazard Perry did is he went over to a second ship. He gave up the ship, which is kind of against what he said, but he went over there and he ended up winning the battle. And he sent back a message to the president saying, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." Okay, and since we had this presence there, since we had these ships there, the British also got a little bit nervous about owning Detroit, which they had taken from General William Hull, and they ended up having to leave Detroit because they were worried that they would get attacked by the ships off of Lake Erie. So after Lake Erie, or actually at the same time that the battle was happening, General William Henry Harrison started to move his troops. And he was a general, an American general, and he started to, they decided that they were going to attack the British and take Detroit back. Okay, and so, but the problem was, by the time they got to Detroit, the British had already gotten nervous because of that fleet, and they had retreated. Now, the shoes on the other foot, the same thing's happening. That group of people is running away from you. They are not in good order. It's easy to harass them. It becomes easy to defeat them. And so he pursued them and went after them, and eventually caught up with them at the Thames River in Canada, and he caught them running away. When he caught them running away, his troops were able to not only harass them, but surround them and win the battle decisively. It was a big American win. And the other thing that happened during this battle, the Battle of Thames, is Tecumseh was killed by the Americans. And with Tecumseh dying, so died the native alliance with the British. So no longer did the British have the natives on their side because they lost Tecumseh, that leader that was on the side of the British. So now we move out of that first phase of the war where Britain was still focusing mainly on France and kind of leaving us alone but fighting us here and there. And we were winning some battles during that time, losing some battles during that time, but it moves into this second phase. And in the second phase of the war, England had defeated France in 1814. And so they were able to focus a lot more of their troops and a lot more of their attention on the only war they had going on, which was the War of 1812. And so they came in and brought in tons and tons of troops, and they immediately sent them right at the capital city of Washington, D.C. And they got to Washington, D.C., and they started to burn down government buildings and burn down houses and try and just burn the entire city to the ground was kind of the goal. Dolly Madison was at the White House at this time. Dolly Madison was the president's wife, the first lady. She was James Madison's wife. And you can see a picture of her up in the corner. This is Dolly Madison, but she is an American hero because she stayed until literally you could almost smell the smoke at the White House from some of the capital cities burning, and you could hear the troops coming in and all that kind of stuff. And what she was doing, the reason she stayed so long, is she was rescuing the historical objects from the White House. So rescuing some of the furniture and the portraits of the presidents and some of the important things that we found really important to our history. And so the reason that we have a lot of the historical artifacts still around to this day is because of this First Lady, is because of Dolly Madison staying and supervising a group of people that were loading them all up onto wagons and getting them out of town before the British could destroy this history. And so after people were shocked and they thought, well, we can't even protect our own capital. This is going to be crazy. Like we're going to get destroyed by these people. And so the British started to move on, and they went on to a much bigger city, and they tried to attack Baltimore. The fort that protects Baltimore, protects the harbor of Baltimore, was called Fort McHenry. And Fort McHenry kind of issued a challenge to the British. They said, we want to get made a flag so large the British will have no trouble seeing it. So they made this flag that is just enormous. I mean, it's bigger than our entire classroom. I mean, it's a huge flag. Okay, I've actually seen it. It's pretty cool. And so if you think about it, it's almost as big as those flags that cover up the football field in the NFL season when they bring the flag out over that entire area. So it's probably about half that big, but it's still a very, very large flag. And so the British sailed up to Fort McHenry, and they saw that flag, and they started to attack Fort McHenry. And you can see a picture right down in the bottom right corner of what Fort McHenry looks like. That's a modern picture, but it's obviously rebuilt in the image as a historical site. And so they started to attack. Okay, and while they're attacking, and there's this fight going on between the fort and the ships, and this fight is just continuing to happen. There's a man that was imprisoned. He had been caught and put into prison on a British ship. And he realized that there was a battle going on. There was all this terrible stuff, and rockets going off, and cannonballs, and all that kind of stuff. And he came up from under the decks from his prison area and came up to the top of the ship to look out, and he saw, after the entire night had gone through and the battle was basically done, that the American flag was still flying there. No one had gone in and taken it over and taken that flag down. And so he was a poet, and so he got inspiration. He grabbed an envelope, the closest envelope to him, and he wrote down a poem that he called the Star Spangled Banner. Now, later on, the Spangled Banner was put to music, and in 1931, it was made into the national anthem of America. And so Francis Scott Key, while he was imprisoned on a British ship, wrote this song about the Battle of Fort McHenry. So our national anthem was written about this battle. Okay, and it was a successful battle because they were able to hold back the British and defend Baltimore, this really big important city, from attack by the British. We'll talk about two other battles to kind of wrap up the War of 1812. One of them was the Battle of Lake Champlain. This was happening up in New York, and the British kind of made a last-ditch attempt to come in and try and cut off New England, which was kind of the center for the factories and commerce and the economy, really the center of the economy, and cut them off from all the rest of the states, therefore leaving America kind of cut into two pieces, and that's what they were hoping to do. But so they came in from Canada, pushed in south, and at the Battle of Lake Champlain, they were beaten by the Americans. Okay. Now, after this battle in 1814, the British were tired of the war. They were done with it. Okay, and so on December 24th of 1814, they created a treaty, they signed it, they were ready to be done with the war. Both sides had agreed and made peace. However, same problem as the beginning of the war, there was really slow mail. It took weeks to months to get in that letter saying that peace had been made back to America. And so in early January of 1815, New Orleans, the Battle of New Orleans happened. And what happened is the British sent in 7,500 troops and dozens of ships to attack the port of New Orleans and try and take this important city away from the Americans. And the Americans patched this force together with this guy named General Andrew Jackson, another name that we're looking at, okay? And Andrew Jackson had this amazing military mind, and he really had a great plan for this. We're going to talk a lot about Andrew Jackson, and he has a tendency to win a lot of the battles that he's in, okay? And so his plan was to use earthworks and riflemen, okay? And he started to explain these. I kind of need to talk about some examples. So earthworks is literally like a mound of dirt that you hide behind, and you're shooting. And so only your head and maybe shoulders, so that you can shoot, is popping up over the ground. That's all they have to shoot at. You're not just standing in a line and they have your whole body to shoot at. So it's much, much more difficult to hit that person that's behind earthworks. And a pile of dirt, even though it seems like really silly and like a shovel can take pieces off of it, dirt will, it'll stop a bullet. Okay, a mound of dirt of the right size will stop a bullet from coming in. So it's like having a complete and total shield over your entire body except for your head, and only your head is up when you're actually firing. So it's a very good defensive tactic. And then they also had these things called rifles. Everybody was using muskets to fight each other back then, but he got his hands on some rifles. And what a rifle does is it takes that same idea of a musket ball and it makes it into kind of a cylinder shape, and then it puts a spin on it. And so the best way to explain this is to really think about holding a basketball in your hand, and you try and throw it as far as you can and as accurately as you can. And you could throw a basketball pretty accurately for maybe 30 feet or 40 feet or something like that if you're really good at it, okay? But it's, the throwing is going to be a little less accurate. It's going to take more skill, more strength, all these different kinds of things. Whereas if you have a football, think about that shape, because the bullet's almost a football shape, and you throw it, you can be way, way more accurate. And the reason you can be way more accurate and throw it way further is because of that spin, the spiral that we talk about. We want every football pass to be a spiral. And so that spiral's going through the air, and that's the same exact idea as a rifle. What it does is it has this groove cut into the inside of the barrel that spins the bullet. And so that spinning of the bullet allows it to travel further and more accurately than a musket ball does. And so these people were protected, and they were way more accurate than their enemies. Okay, and so this small group of Americans were able to fight off 7,500 troops in New Orleans, and there were only 71 American casualties. And casualty is another weird word, right, that we haven't come up against yet. A casualty means someone that was injured or killed in battle. And so 71 Americans, and then there were 2,000 British casualties during this battle. And again, the only reason it happened is because the mail was too slow. Peace had already been made before this battle even happened. So the peace that we talked about that had been decided before the Battle of New Orleans was called the Treaty of Ghent, and it was called the Treaty of Ghent because it was found, or they came to peace in a conference in a place called Ghent. Right, the city's name was Ghent, and so it ended the war. Now, the thing about the War of 1812 that's kind of strange is there really were no real winners at all. Okay, there was no territory change, so Canada didn't get any bigger, America didn't get any bigger, none of them took any land from each other, and in the end, they were still fighting about who they can trade with and who they were going to allow to trade with the other one. So there was still the same problems were left over from it. But there were some really positive consequences of the war that made the Americans feel like they had won it. Okay, the first one, and there are 4 of them here. Okay, the first one is that these new people, these heroes that had won battles in here, had increased our patriotism. They had made us feel better about America and safer in America, having these people defending and protecting us. People like Andrew Jackson, people like William Henry Harrison, people like Oliver Hazard Perry were on our side, which made us seem like a much stronger country. The second thing that it did is it completely broke the strength of the natives. From here on out, the natives would essentially not even be able to put up any fight at all. Okay, it became a very, very unfair fight. Even though it was unfair from the beginning, this basically was the end of any real resistance to America. And the third thing is it allowed us to manufacture more of our own stuff. Because people stopped letting us trade with European countries, we had to figure out how are we going to turn our cotton into t-shirts? How are we going to turn our iron ore into shovels? How are we going to turn all of these things into stuff you can actually use? Because before this, we were just sending all the raw materials, all the stuff that America had, over to Europe, and we get paid for it, and then we'd buy our goods. We'd buy our shovels and shirts and stuff like that from Europe. And so this allowed us to really get into making our own items. And then the last thing and the most important thing is we realized that that whole, I talked about, it was the whole Second War of Independence. It felt like Britain was trying to take us over again. And so really what it was is it was proof that we could defend ourselves. We could fight against a first-class country, one of the most powerful countries in the whole world, and we could survive it. And so it was just proof that America was right up there with the rest of those countries.